everyone, Kat here. Being active in the world of Pokemon fanfiction for a while, there's a phenomenon I've noticed that seems to apply to larger fanfic groups and even writing communities in general. Namely that lots of people have ideas, less people turn them into finished stories. It's not uncommon to see Reddit users offering up an idea hoping somebody will be inspired enough to create a finished fanfic from it. The problem is, ideas are only starting points. They're not fully developed stories. You can come up with a general concept or a few pivotal scenes, but when you try to write with only that, you tend to get stuck when it comes to what happens between those pivotal scenes. Now what? Well, if you like games, I say this on my gaming channel, you're in luck. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use both video games and board games to develop your characters and ideas and get your story going, whether it's a fanfic or something totally original. Because as much as we think of games as rivals for both our attention and our readers' attention, they can actually be helpful tools. Now, there's a couple different ways we can utilize games when it comes to writing. The first is to help us develop those characters and settings and plots that feel really big and complicated in our head, but may not have as much detail as we actually thought they did. Games can also help us keep organized and stay on track. There's a couple different reasons that people will procrastinate when it comes to writing or anything really. Maybe the project feels too big, or maybe there's just too many other distractions around. So games can help us with both those things. If you're working with a co-author, games can codify that cooperative storytelling element to stop the story from being dominated by only one person. And finally, games can ease the stress we put on ourselves to create stuff. What do I mean by that? We often get told that complex characters and settings will make the story. They will write the story for you. But fun fact, we are not story creating robots. And try as we like, we can't produce complex protagonists that the audience will cheer for completely out of thin air. And a lot of times we get in this mentality where we associate the productivity of writing with our word count. And that's just not how any creative process works. But a lot of people will put pressure on themselves, especially if they have a really restricted amount of time they can write, to produce something during that time. Then they can't think of any creative ideas, and when they actually go for a walk or something, the ideas come. Often the big thing we need to get going is just more time in our own worlds. So let's start off with one of the most obvious ways games can help: visualizing our cast. More and more games nowadays are coming with character creators, really complex ones, built right into the game itself. Even if it's just a fighting game like Soul Calibur, you can really go into a lot of nice detail and make this representation of your character as you're seeing them in your head. And sometimes just that is enough to help the character feel real to the writer, and therefore know what they would say or do in a situation. Or maybe you need something a little more than that. You have two different types of games that have character creation tools in them. You have your plot-driven stuff where not only do you create the character, you make choices within the game for that character, which can also really help you develop who they are. Or you have sandbox games where there's no real plot or objective for this character. You just make it up as you go. Some people enjoy that more restrictive format, while other people thrive in the sandbox format. Stuff like Minecraft and The Sims. Because, of course, I'm going to talk about The Sims. This is really one of my favorite games when it comes to sandbox character development. I love how much detail you can put into customizing the looks and the personality, as well as the setting. I've spent probably more time in build mode than I would like to admit. I personally prefer Sims 4, but that would just happen to be the game in the series I got started on. In Sims 4, you have these 3 different personality traits. When your character is a child or younger, you only have one. Become a teen, you get a second one, and then become an adult, you get a third one. And they've built a new system into the game where you can add additional traits depending on how your character behaves, which is really a neat way to discover traits about your character that maybe you didn't think of off the top of your head. If you have just a general concept of a character and you're trying to learn a little bit more about them, this is one of my favorite games for solo play. But remember, the main idea here is to have fun with your character in your setting in a creative way. If you turn The Sims or any sandbox game on and make your character, and you're playing with this idea that the quality of your character will increase in tandem with the number of hours you have played, you will be sad. That will not end well. Now, when it comes to crafting these characters' personalities, there's some traits that are kind of neutral, a bunch that are obviously good, and there are character traits that are maybe less good. And I really like to have a little bit of each, usually one negative trait and two positive traits. And the reason I do this is to avoid the dreaded Mary Sue. Now, a Mary Sue is a term that gets thrown around a lot, probably a lot more than it needs to. The origin of the term is from a Star Trek fanfiction where a writer did this parody story about their character, Mary Sue, who was the youngest to accomplish all these amazing things. Everyone loved her, and in the end, she died an absolutely tragic death, and all the characters mourn her loss, and a national holiday is declared. That's where it comes from, but a lot of times it gets applied to just characters who are good at stuff, and that's not really what it means. What it comes down to is Mary Sues are characters that are always right, and any flaws they have are not their fault or only serve to endear them to the audience. So for example, their fault is they're clumsy, oh no, they fall into the hero's arms, or they work too hard, they're just too nice, and they have so many friends they can't possibly keep up with them all. It's not that these things can't ever be flaws, but they have to actually have negative consequences for the character. And quite frankly, being clumsy isn't actually a character flaw. Flaws have to be something that the character can and should change about themselves so that they are better to other people. Another thing that Mary Sues tend to suffer from is something called character-centric morality, which is if the protagonist does it, it's not bad. If other characters do it against the protagonist, they are bad. And these characters do have their place in things like wish fulfillment stories, where the whole idea is for the reader to be the protagonist and to succeed in all these wonderful things through them. And quite frankly, that's a pretty good use for The Sims too. But for the purposes of telling a story, you don't really want the protagonist to be the one in the right all the time. Now, if The Sims feels a little too restrictive in the number of traits that it offers you, there's two books I really recommend, the Positive Trait Thesaurus and the Negative Trait Thesaurus, which just have a whole ton of different personality traits you can try to apply to your characters. And not only do they have a lot of examples of how these play out in other books or film or TV, they will also have suggested contradictory traits that you can try putting together, and that can really help your cast be very unique, which is a lot of fun. So I highly recommend these books. Okay, let's get off The Sims for a bit, because believe it or not, there are other simulation games out there. I'm really excited for Paralives, which is a pretty similar game. It's an indie game that's going to be coming out supposedly in 2025 somewhere. But so far, all the videos they've shown of the previews of how the characters look and move, and especially how you can design the settings, I've definitely got my eye on that one. You also have mobile games like Virtual Families, and I'll get a little more into mobile games in general in a bit here, and The Sims has its own mobile version as well. You also have a whole series of games where you aren't creating an entire cast of characters. You create a single character, every other user does the same, and you all go and interact with each other through your avatars. I don't find these good for developing stories just because of how much having control over only your protagonist limits you, but let's talk mobile games a little bit here. Because yes, you do have your games that are sort of mini versions of The Sims, but you also have games and apps that are designed specifically for character and room design, which can be really helpful for a writer. Now, the downside with these games is they are really limited in what they can do and display as opposed to PC or console games. They really have to be economic with that space and simplify a lot of things. Plus, pretty much all the mobile games run on the system of free to play, and then you have to pay for things to expand the game more. So a lot of free apps will try to entice you with, oh, just do this one more thing, it'll only take a couple of seconds, and then before you know it, 3 hours have passed by, all while you're just trying to get the good stuff that you actually want to play with. A lot of the room design apps I've tried are especially notorious for this. So when I'm looking at a mobile game and trying to analyze whether or not it's actually helpful for me as a writer, I always ask myself 3 questions. 1, am I being creative? 2, am I relaxing? And 3, am I having fun? And if it's no to any of those, probably a good time to give the game a rest. But not all mobile games are giant time sucks. If you go into your phone's app store, you can find tons of apps under the category of productivity. And if you gamify staying on task, that can be super helpful. Life Up is one I've been trying recently. That's what the screenshot here is from. You basically create tasks and then you assign a rating to each task, which is how important is this and how difficult is this. When you complete the task, it gives you coins and XP towards yourself, the character in the game. You can customize the store to have pretty much whatever you want in it, and I actually went and connected the whole thing to a new Animal Crossing island that I started. I actually started the island of Paseo as Leah from Pokemon, so that should be interesting. In my shop here, I put icons for all the different building materials. And so Lear is not actually able to build anything on the island unless I mail the materials to him because I got them from my shop on Life Up. I'm also a really big fan of Forest, which is a game that will take up your screen on your mobile device with a growing tree for whatever amount of time you set it for. And then as the timer continues, the tree grows until it's fully grown after the timer is done. You can also put fun little sounds to it and add a bunch of your own inspirational quotes. Mine is full of Pokemon and writing related ones, of course. But honestly, these just happen to be my fave apps that I've found. Any app that lets you create a checklist, plus any game that lets you control your received resources in some way, can be used like this. Now, I talked a lot about character development. Let's talk about setting. There's a whole bunch of games that are really just designed around building a setting. A lot of them are built around designing larger spaces, things like SimCity, City Skylines, and TinyGlade. But you also want to really consider the smaller spaces that your character is going to be inhabiting. You don't want any white room syndrome, which is basically where your character seems to be doing whatever it is they're doing in a completely blank room because absolutely nothing is described. So apps and games that focus on room design can also be relaxing and fun and helpful for you as a writer. These sorts of programs have a huge range of what they can do and how much they cost. But whatever app you use, you really want to have your character interact with whatever happens to be there, not just describe it at the beginning of the chapter and then move on as if none of this stuff exists. You also really want to think about how much control your character had over this space that they're inhabiting. Is the decor here all their personal choice, and what part of it isn't? And how do they use what parts they can control? Also, how would they describe it to other people? Once you have a room designed, try writing a description of it just purely from your character's point of view and really try to bring their voice to the table. Now, I've said a few times that setting is definitely not my strong suit. A lot of times I'll struggle to visualize things without an app to help me, but also I'll struggle with how my character is moving about the room. I might have them go downstairs to do something and then forget which direction I sent them in and send them downstairs again to return to the spot where they supposedly started. So a couple options here. When it comes to things like action scenes, I've actually used the tabletop RPG grid system. I love tabletop RPGs. They're basically make-believe, but just with some rules to it. I'm actually running a campaign right now with the Fate Accelerated system. The manual is pretty slim, so it was pretty easy to pick up and learn, and it really relies a lot more on creativity than a lot of other RPG systems do. You don't really have stats on a lot of things. The rolls you do to see how well you succeed at something really come down to how you're approaching it and whether or not that's a typical approach for you versus the specific details of whatever weapon or magic item you happen to be using. It really is a game designed for storytellers. So rather than specific rule systems, everything has what's called an aspect, a description of some kind. All the characters have aspects, objects have aspects, rooms have aspects, and a lot of what the characters do in gameplay is go and try to either change aspects of something or utilize the aspects of something to their advantage. Another big thing I like about this system is it actually rewards the players for keeping in character in a way that is detrimental to their character's progress. So if you surrender in a fight rather than waiting till you're knocked out, or if you just make a poor choice that your character would almost certainly make, you can earn what are called fate points, which you can then spend later to have your character do something really cool. There's really this negotiation that goes on in the gameplay between the game master and the players. Now, it does have the disadvantage of being less known, as opposed to Dungeons & Dragons. I find that Dungeons & Dragons can handle it a little better if you have people in your group who just aren't as into the storytelling element of it. With Fate Accelerated, you could almost use it with a group of 2 to 3 writers and create your story using that system and get something that feels unique and intriguing. Dungeons & Dragons is pretty restricted to the high fantasy genre, although it does have packages like the Spelljammer series, and of course lots of homebrew that can use the system in slightly different settings. I think it's a really good creative exercise, even if you're not in the midst of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, to take a character that you've been building up for a story and create a Dungeons & Dragons version of them, because they do have a really nice system for character design. The D&D system uses a combination of what are called ideals, bonds, flaws, and alignment to craft your character's personality. Your ideal being, what is the one principle you would never betray? Your bond being, who or what are you strongly connected to? And then your flaw being, what is a way that someone could exploit you if they wanted to? There are 9 different alignments, and there's 2 parts to them. What are your morals, and do they have a set of guiding principles in their own life that they are true to, whether they're good or bad? There are plenty of other RPG systems, of course. Cypher is similar in a lot of ways to Fate Accelerated, but it has a lot more rules in place. But it is equally open to a whole bunch of different genres. The game actually has a whole set of modules that you can use depending on which genre you want your game and story to take place in. So it is very flexible that way, which I like. Shadowrun is set in its futuristic sci-fi setting, and this one actually uses a whole lot of D6s to determine the outcome rather than using different sided die, and how good or bad you are at something will determine how many D6s you roll. The one downside of this as far as storytelling is concerned is characters can die extremely easily in this game. They are quite realistic with things like weaponry, and yes, if your character gets shot, that character is probably not going to survive. Or maybe they'll take a hit, but they're just barely hanging on. And while that is really good for drama within the actual gameplay, it's not as helpful if you were envisioning this character as your protagonist in a story and trying to get to know them better. You also have Cortex Prime, which is the system that is used in the official Dragon Prince RPG, Tales of Xadia. In this system, they do use a range of different sided dice like in D&D. But similar to Shadowrun, how good or bad you are at something determines how high a die you are allowed to use. And you can step up or step down depending on specific circumstances in the gameplay. My friends and I all play online on Roll20, which has a whole lot of different systems available for people to try out and learn more about. But just as a general rule, whatever RPG system it is you're thinking of trying out, for storytelling specifically, the less rules, the more open to a change in the story it's going to be. There are also much shorter games that can help get those creative juices flowing, and any of these are really fun to play with a small group. When I Dream is a very family-friendly board game if you have kids. It comes with a set of cards with different pictures on them, and one person is the dreamer who is blindfolded. The rest of the players are divided into 2 groups, one that's trying to get the dreamer to guess the pictures on the cards, and the other one who's trying to misdirect and get them to make a guess that is wrong. Now, when the timer runs out before the dreamer takes their blindfold off, it is their job to recount the dream they had with as many of the words as they guessed, and remember, they don't know which ones were right or wrong, they make up a story about what their dream was using as many of those words as they can. So it's got that storytelling element in there, but also kind of a memory game too. It's a lot of fun to play. I recommend that one. Rory Story Cubes are more specifically aimed at writers, and as you can see from the picture, it's just a bunch of D6s with a whole bunch of different little tiny icons on them, and there's a bunch of varieties of these things. The easiest way to play is to just roll the dice, whatever number you want, and try to come up with a story based on the pictures that come up. So I guess it's more of a tool/game. There are rules for a more gamified version of it, but a lot of writers I know just use these things as kind of story starting, brainstorming types of tools. Once Upon a Time is a card game in which there are a whole bunch of different cards with story elements in them, and each player gets a handful of cards and also a story ending. And you take turns telling this story, but the challenge is to keep the story consistent. If someone either loses the thread, thinks too long, or contradicts something that was said earlier, they lose their turn and someone else gets to pick it up. And then your objective is to get rid of all the cards in your hand and finish with your story ending, thus concluding the entire story that everyone has told together. This one is a lot of fun and I really enjoy it as well. Not quite as kid-friendly as When I Dream. It is a lot of pressure to try and think up a story on the spot, and some kids just might get really stressed out about that rather than find it fun. Betrayal at Baldur's Gate is actually part of the D&D universe, and the reason I put it up there is that it's sort of its own D&D-esque adventure in a box. So if that's something you'd like to get into, but you really aren't very familiar with the system at all, this is really kind of a nice way to dip your toes into it. And finally, we have Dixit, which isn't so much a storytelling game in and of itself, but it has these beautifully illustrated cards with these elaborate and fantastical illustrations on them. Gameplay goes that each person has a handful of cards, and the active player picks one of those cards, puts it down, and gives a clue. What they want to do with this clue is they don't want everybody to guess what's on the card, but they want some people to guess what's on the card. And then after they give their clue, all the other players in the group pick a card of the ones in their hand and also put it down. They're trying to put in cards that might trick everybody into thinking that they are the card that the original player had in their hand. But the gameplay aside, what I really love this for is just using the cards in a similar way to Rory Story Cubes as a way to strike inspiration or try and get over some sort of hurdle in the plot where you really need something new. And the cards here are really good at providing that. Finally, I just want to close with one final thought, because I've been talking about games as a way to help writers, but games are much more story-driven than they used to be. So if you're both a gamer and a writer, there actually are apps out there that can help you tell your story in the medium of a game, even if you're not particularly skilled at programming. There's programs like Episode, Virtual Novel Maker, and RPG Maker that are letting people tell stories through games in a way that they really couldn't before. It's such an exciting time to be a storyteller. And if you only take one thing from this video, I hope it's that you've got tools to help kick down that writer's block. If you're sitting down to write and you're getting stuck and you're focused on your word count, first and foremost, don't stress about it. Step away from the project and see what you can do to get to know your setting and your characters in a better way. Also, when you have a new idea for a character, you can try doing this stuff at the very beginning while you're still in your mid-inspiration and see how games can help you learn more about them. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Until next time, happy reading and happy training that writing brain.